very quickly, just take us through the massive breakthroughs in this deal. What do they mean?
Well, both leaders said that this was a new chapter in their relations, and let's not forget there's been bad blood for years now, so they're both clearly sound pretty optimistic about a new start. The key breakthrough really is this green lane and red lane. So what that means is that for goods that are transiting between the UK mainland and Northern Ireland, paperwork is reduced, so it gets closer to the frictionless trade between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK that has been a goal of the UK in these Brexit negotiations for many years now, Annette. There's also a red lane planned, which is for goods that are going between the UK and the EU, because the Republic of Ireland remains in the European Union. So goods going from the UK into EU territory, that's the Republic of Ireland, they go through a red lane. They didn't really explain in the press conference exactly how those checks work, because according to Ursula von der Leyen, there is still no hard border on the island of Ireland. So they've got some kind of smart technology, I'm guessing, or something like that, to check the goods that are going between these two different zones. And just one final point, Ursula von der Leyen confirming that there will be a role for the European Court of Justice if necessary. That's to say, if there are trade disputes between the UK and the EU further down the line, the ECJ is the final safeguard. But she also emphasized that there were mechanisms that had been come up with in this new framework to try to avoid getting to the ECJ being involved in any way. So they're really going to try to avoid having to invoke the European Court of Justice, because everyone knows this is a big red flag for the most ardent Brexiteers in the UK. So that's kind of the compromise or landing zone.
Armen, we're continuing with our coverage, so I've now got more time to ask you a little bit more detailed questions. Okay. I know you're doing your best there to, basically sum it up in less than 2 minutes. But just coming back to the major points in this deal, what we were seeing from the two leaders is basically a realignment, if you like, in that both the UK and the EU see this deal, which has been called the Windsor Framework, named after the English town where it was signed off on, as being a reset, if you like, for the two parties to come back to the table and start negotiating further details about the nature of this Northern Ireland protocol, not to mention other issues as well.
Yeah, and I think you could hear, well, first of all, just on the sort of the ambience, I mean, obviously you and I were not there, but Ursula von der Leyen, she was clearly quite relaxed, quite, smiling a lot. She seemed in a kind of different frame than what a lot of press conferences that I've seen her in the last few months. So there's definitely kind of the sense that something new could be beginning here. And you could hear at the end of that press conference, her final response was about the Horizon program, which is basically this Windsor Framework deal, in theory, unblocks the possibility for British scientists, particularly those based in Northern Ireland, to come into this EU program to share resources, finances, and so forth, to basically integrate at least part of the UK scientific community into the EU. And I think certainly on the EU side of things, that will be seen, if it goes through, as a sign that this Northern Ireland Protocol deal is actually opening the way for other areas of cooperation as well. Rishi Sunak didn't mention Horizon. I think he's obviously a bit circumspect about that, but he did mention energy, for example. He mentioned a couple of other areas where the EU and the UK could cooperate going forward. So I think he also sees this as the beginning of something new, but he has to be careful about what he says, because he still has a lot of hurdles to jump over to actually get all of this approved.
And what about the European Court of Justice? I mean, that is very interesting in terms of the fact that it looks like under this agreement, correct me if I'm wrong, that they would have some sort of power, if you like, over this, the territory of Northern Ireland.
Yeah, that's correct, because remember that the Brexit deal effectively leaves Northern Ireland within the EU's single market when it comes to goods. So Northern Ireland is in this sort of slightly ambiguous situation, but it does remain effectively part of the single market. And if you have a territory that is in the EU single market, then by definition, the European Court of Justice has power in that territory. So essentially what they're saying is, yes, Ursula von der Leyen confirmed that the ECJ would have a say if there was a kind of major dispute, but there's also mechanisms that they've worked on. We'll have to see what the text of the Windsor Framework actually says to see because obviously the devil is always in the details in this sort of thing. But they're saying, both Sunak and von der Leyen, that there are mechanisms that have been put in place to avoid having to trigger the European Court of Justice to finally deliver a verdict if there is a trade dispute. And politically, in the background of that, of course, Annette, is a realization that there are political forces and individuals in the UK that will reject any role for the European Court of Justice in any way, shape or form.
I'm certainly going to throw this question to Benedict Pavio, our London correspondent, who's actually in Windsor and we'll be talking to shortly. But it seems like the ground has changed somewhat since the last round of Brexit negotiations, in the sense that the UK economically is suffering majorly, and people are starting to realise, the electorate that is, that Brexit perhaps has not been the great success that it was touted to be. Is this part of the reason why Rishi Sunak has gone in there with a commitment to come to some sort of agreement on this very thorny issue about Northern Ireland?
I mean, there's obviously internal and external factors. So in the UK, a lot of people obviously now want to move on, and if there's a deal that is done, there are perhaps fewer purists now saying this kind of Brexit is a betrayal or that Brexit is a betrayal. I think there is a slightly more perhaps pragmatic backdrop in the UK. And you've also got to consider Sunak's relationship with the EU, which is very different from what his predecessors had. That's to say, not just Boris Johnson, but Liz Truss as well. Remember how Boris Johnson negotiated the original Northern Ireland Protocol, but then went back on it. And suddenly he and his team, Lord Frost and so forth, started saying, this protocol, which we negotiated, by the way, has lost the trust of the people of Northern Ireland. That really rubbed the EU up the wrong way, and particularly Emmanuel Macron, the French president. What we've seen in the last few months is Rishi Sunak building a new relationship with Emmanuel Macron. They're basically these sort of two finance guys who sort of understand each other. And at the moment, as long as Rishi Sunak is seen as someone who keeps his word, which obviously both Paris and Brussels thought Boris Johnson was not somebody who would keep his word. As long as they can see that Rishi Sunak can keep his word and is willing to do everything to push this through, they on the EU and French side are willing to be a bit more flexible that they ultimately were willing to be for Boris Johnson.
Armen Georgian, thank you for that.